This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Okay, welcome everyone to we continue in our series on Tefillah. Today's subject is HaNoten LaYaef Koach. So you say, you just did that. Yeah, we did the first part, right? But now we have another one. I actually gave that shir in this week on Tuesday night in Tzfas, in the Arizal Sephardi Shul. I gave the shir about the two great luminaries, Arizal versus the Beis Yosef. Okay, so we were speaking about that subject. We mentioned, is HaNoten LaYaef Koach found in the Gemara and Brachos? No. Is it found in the Gemara Menachos? No. Is it found anywhere? No. So some say the source of it is the Arizal, and therefore it's recommended to say, based on the power and the koach of the Arizal has the capacity to direct us, and we follow what he says, despite the fact it's not in the Gemara. But others suggest no. Rabbi Yosef mentioned the possibility of the Bach, that maybe in fact the Gemara does have the Gersa of HaNoten LaYaef Koach. But then we brought the Shal Sechuvas Tzemach Tzedek, that HaNoten LaYaef Koach was a takana of the Geonim. So my father shared with me that there is a big discussion in halacha about whether something enacted by the Geonim has the same power of something that is found in Shas. Because it's interesting, if somebody forgets, or Micha, we don't go back. But some Rishonim, there's a Tosfos that says you do go back. What's the machlokes? The Birkas Avram says, the machlokes is that these tefillos were enacted by the Geonim, and do we say, Kol HaMashana Mimabea Shetavu Chachomim Yadai Al Tachtoino, or Chayzrim applies even to a takana of the Geonim. But now we're going to learn today another possibility, that it could be HaNoten LaYaef Koach was enacted even earlier. But here's the reason why I wanted to give a part 2 of this subject, and that is, somebody asked me, Dr. Menachem Fuchs of Cedarhurst, New York, asked me that if it's not in the Gemara, fine. So whoever did it, be it the Arizal, be it the Geonim, maybe it was earlier, why did they feel the need to make a bracha? In other words, the Gemara says you wake up in the morning, you hear the rooster, you make a bracha. You open your eyes, fakechivim. You put on clothing, you say malbish arumim. You stretch out, you say mater asrum. You stand up straight, you say zoikev kefufim. You walk, you say hamechin mitzadei gaver. You put your feet on the ground, you say roikar salamoyim. You say shasali kol tzarki when you put on your shoes, you put on your belt, or you say you put on your hat, or you safara. And the Gemara doesn't say that you need to make a bracha asking Hashem for koach. So why did the later authorities feel that it's so important that what the Gemara listed as brachas you don't have to say? You must say God gives strength to the weary. In other words, what compelled the later Chachamim to enact this bracha? So I thought that was a very important question. Right. If it's not in the Gemara, so what changed that we have to make this bracha? Now the Torah says, there's another bracha in the Sidurim of the Ashkenazim that says, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam HaNoten LaYaef Koach. So again, the Torah is acknowledging it's not in the Gemara, but it's in the Ashkenazic Sidurim. And why was it enacted? V'niskan al she'adam mafkid nishmasai ba'erev b'yad HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And it's enacted because in the evening a person deposits his soul by God. Ayefa, your soul is worn out, me'avoda kasha, from hard work kol hayom. Umachzir eloi b'boker sheketa v'shalva, and he returns in the morning. Al pi hamedrash chadashim labikorim rabba emunasecha basar adam mafkid pikadon biyad chaveroi umachzir eloi b'aloi makukal. A man of flesh and blood gives a deposit to somebody, and the guy returns it, and it's completely worn out. Aval adam mafkid b'chol erev nishmasa b'yad HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But by God, it's just the opposite. Like if I lend you my book, usually I lend someone a book and I get it back. Like the guy, I don't know what he did. He poured Coca-Cola on it, then he ate cholent on it. I know his entire eating schedule for the last 2 weeks, right? I know what he had, milchiks, fleishiks. The whole sefer is mamish aser b'hana. It's milchiks, fleishiks, chametz, yayin, nesech, and avodah zarah together. So, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we give it to him worn out, and he gives it fully charged. Aval Adam mafkid b'chol erev neshos v'yagis baruch hu v'hu hayefa machzir lo chadash regua. So according to this, the reason for the bracha is you're wiped out in the night and you wake up fresh. So I don't understand. People before, in the times of the Gemara, they weren't tired during the day. Only after the times of the Gemara, people became tired. Why was this Gemara enacted dafka later on? Maybe you could say just just off the bat, the Mishnah says, the end of Soita, that when the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, different brachos were taken out of the world, and we're basically further and further and further from Gan Eden, and the klala of B'zeh Asapecha Toich Halechem intensifies and increases. So, I'll give you an example. The Chayyadam writes that in his times, Nebuch Balabatim only learned 3 hours a day. People, the Chayyadam says in his times, a working person had to work so hard that he only had time to learn 3 hours a day. Nowadays, if you learn 3 hours a day, you're ready from the Rashka Bahag, you're ready to Gadol Hadar if you learn 3 hours a day. Back in the day, you were an Amoris if you learned 3 hours a day. So what do we see? That the curse of work increases and increases. And nowadays, you have people, they work like 18 hours straight. So it could be that back in the day, when people weren't so tired at the end of the day, they worked for 2 hours, and the rest of the day they davened and they learned. So they weren't shmata at the end of the day. Nowadays, when they said B'zeh Hapecha for our time, they weren't joking. So people are much more worn out. So maybe that's why they felt the need to be Masake and HaNoten Levkach. But let's look in Reb Schwab. Reb Schwab writes, the bracha of HaNoten LaYaef Koach is not brought in the Gemara. Now he says an interesting chidush. I don't know where he gets it from. He says it was enacted earlier than the Geonim. Now how could he be earlier than the Geonim and after the time of the Gemara? So we know there was a tekufa in history between the Amoraim and the Geonim, and they're called Rabbanon Savaroi. And they did add certain things to the Gemara, like in the beginning of Kedushin, there's certain things that the Rabbanon Savaroi added. And one of them says Reb Schwab, is the bracha of HaNoten LaYaef Koach. He says they were after the Amoraim, before the Geonim, and they were Magia, the Nusach of the Gemara, and sometimes they added things in the Gemara. And this bracha was enacted for the kindness that Kadosh Baruch Hu does with a person, that when a person goes into his bed to sleep, he's tired and worn out, and you wake up with a fresh outlook. But Reb Schwab asks a very gavaldig kasha. Paikeach ivrim, malbish arumim, matir asurim, clothing. Everybody, all of mankind has the gift of clothing. Some choose not to wear it, but that's their problem, right? But everybody believes in the value of wearing clothing, except for the editors of the New York Times, right? But besides them, all of mankind believe in the importance of wearing clothing. All of mankind believe in the importance of have the gift of eyesight, have the gift of walking, and so that's how we don't say Paikeach Ivrei Amal Yisrael. We don't say Malbush Arume Amal Yisrael. These are gifts to all of mankind. Then we conclude Oizer Yisrael Bigvura, Oiter Yisrael B'Sefara. Why would we then go back and say HaNoten LaYaef Koach, which is a bracha to everybody? It's sort of out of order. If you want to say a bracha to everyone, we should say Shasali Kotzar Hamechem Tzadei Gavar, Shasali Kotzarki, HaNoten LaYaef Koach, Oizer Yisrael Bigvura, Oiter Yisrael B'Sefara. Why do we revert back to a bracha that is for all mankind? Aval Yesh Lahavan asks Reb Schwab, Shabracha Zu Shayeches Lahoidois Aroiv Hatava Shaisak Ezrahim Klalos Bnei Adam Kamay Paikeach Ivrim. Shenizdara Bracha Zu Achar Hoidois Hamichadas Yisrael. Why was this bracha arranged dafka for those gratitudes that are given specifically to the Jewish people? That's question number one. Question number two, Va'oid Kasha. Sharei kvar beirachnu berchas paikeach ivrim, zoikev kefufim, alatzam hakoch shenin ulanu. We already thank God for strength. We could see, we could stand. We thank God we could walk. So why do we have to thank Hashem for koach again? We already did that. all the brachos that were said about sight, about walking, about stretching, why do we need HaNoten LaYaef Koach? And so that's question number 2. And we asked the third question, maybe more basic and important, is that why was it enacted? For what purpose? It's not in the Gemara. In the Gemara's time, people weren't so worn out that they had to say HaNoten LaYaef Koach. What changed after the Chasimas HaTalmud? Now, in our shir on the bracha Malbesh Harumim, we mentioned from the Arizal, the Chidah quoted the Arizal, that when we say the bracha Malbesh Harumim, that there are some souls that are completely bare. They have no clothes, they have nothing to coat themselves with. They have no mitzvahs, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu clothes them. But there are some neshamas that are not completely bare, but they're worn out and tired, and Hashem gives them strength. That's the kavanah of the bracha Malbesh Harumim and HaNoten LaYaef Koach. Which, by the way, begs the question that if in the time of the Gemara you only had people who had no mitzvahs, and therefore they made the bracha Malbesh Harumim, so they needed to add a bracha of HaNoten LaYaef Koach, some people who have some mitzvahs. If they would have been Masakin Malbesh Harumim after the Chasimas Hashas, then you could have said, in the times of the Gemara, you only had people who did few mitzvahs. You didn't have people who are completely arum. And now, after the Chasimas HaTalmud, you have people who need a complete wardrobe. So then you could say they were Masakin Malbesh Harumim. But once Malbesh Harumim was already said, why do they need to add HaNoten LaYaef Koach? Here, look in the Sefer Oilas Tamid. The Sefer Oilas Tamid from Reb Shmuel Hamaner, he says, he's one of the tzaddikim who wrote a sefer on Tefillah. He says that when a person sins, he strips his cloak of kedusha, and he dons and he's clothed in soiled garments, depending on how bad the sin is. If the sin is lenient and small, then the clothing of his neshama becomes very weak, but is not completely removed. And if the chet is chamor, he loses the levush completely. So connected these two levels, they were masakin Malbesh Harumim and HaNoten LaYaef Koach. Because every night when a person deposits the neshama by Hashem, the soul is renewed. If you lose your clothing, so then Hashem gives you a new cloak. That's Malbesh Harumim. And someone who has a cloak, but it's just weak, Hashem gives him strength. That's HaNoten LaYaef Koach. But again, we don't really understand why this bracha, maybe we'll turn off the heat, why this bracha was specifically enacted after the close of the Gemara. So what we have to understand, says Reb Schwab, and maybe I'm going to offer a different interpretation, is what is the source of the bracha HaNoten LaYaef Koach? Because all brachos are rooted in the words of Tanakh. So there's a pasuk in Yeshaya, HaNoten LaYaef Koach, Uli einoinim atzma yarbe. Can I have a Yeshaya? It says, he gives the weary koach, and to those who have no strength, he increases their power. Okay. I need a translation here. Yeshaya Mem Chavtes. It's Noisen LaYaef Koach Ule'einoinim Atzma Yarbe. Who does this refer to? Noisen LaYaef Koach. Who are these people who are Yaef? Says Radak, V'hu yitain k'sheyirtzeh, he will give when he wants, Koach v'atzma liYisrael, shehem begolus v'ya'ifim yigeim einoinim. Who are the weak and the weary? Klal Yisrael. When are they weak and weary? In the golus. So this would answer all the questions. Because we asked, why is this bracha after the bracha specifically that are referring to the benefits given to Klal Yisrael? They should be before Oizer Yisrael B'Gvura, before Oiter Yisrael B'Sefara. Why listed after? Secondly, why was this bracha enacted dafka after the close of the Shas? The answer is very simple. that now that the Golus has lasted so long, and we're worn out from the Golus, this is a bracha of the strength that HaKadosh Baruch Hu infuses Klal Yisrael with in the Golus. It says Reb Schwab, Kfar heyarnu, shebracha zu miyusedas aloshen HaPasuk, noisein LaYaef Koach u'le'enoinim atzma yarbe. Now there's a chiluk between LaYaef and LaYaef. LaYaef is someone who still has Koach. LaYaef is a guy who's dozing off during the shir. He can wake up. He chooses not to, right? He's dozing off. He still has some koach. LaYaef he's depleted completely. And the Mefarshim say, the Radak, look in the Malbim number 7, the LaYaef is Yisrael. Our LaYaef from koach. Imkain, says the Reb Schwab, HaKavana Masha Tamu Koiches B'nei Yisrael B'Galuseim Tachas Oshi Ben Malchios. So you could say the Rabbanon Savaroi, who saw the length of the Galus because of our many sins. Therefore, in order to infuse us with strength and courage and hope in this long bitter Galus, they were masakin a bracha to thank Hashem that He infuses koach to Am Yisrael to tolerate, to suffer, to be soivel, the yoke of the goyim. Now we understand why this bracha is said specifically after Oizer Yisrael b'Gvura, Oitar Yisrael b'Sefara. V'shaper makom bracha zu kan, between the brachas that are shaykh to Klal Yisrael, and it's apart from the brachas that are for all of mankind. Now, even though this bracha certainly means kipshutai, that Hashem renews our koyach, but if this was the only kavana, then it would not make sense to say afterwards, Hamaver Sheina Me'enai. In other words, if the sole purpose of the bracha was God gives us strength, then it makes no sense to say, and God takes the sleep away from our eyes. We just said that, God gives us strength. It must be the gratitude of God giving us strength refers specifically not to our endurance in the morning, but for our stay in the Galus. I would still ask on this pshat that why is it before Oizer Yisrael b'Gvura, Oitar Yisrael b'Sefara? Yes, it's only to Klal Yisrael, but we don't specifically say it's only to Klal Yisrael. It's also to all of mankind. So shouldn't it be, you want to put it together with Oizer Yisrael or Oitar Yisrael, but maybe it should be right before Oizer Yisrael b'Gvura, or Oitar Yisrael b'Sefara. Why is it like after? Why is it on a higher level? Meaning it sounds like the first brachas are to all mankind. And then we say, according to Reb Schwab, 3 brachos to Klal Yisrael. Oizer Yisrael b'Gvura, Oitar Yisrael b'Sefara, and then HaNoten LaYaef Koach. But why wouldn't we put HaNoten LaYaef Koach before Oizer Yisrael b'Gvura? So I just want to add one little point. The Targum Yonasan ben Uziel on the pasuk of Noisen LaYaef Koach learns that it's not just referring to Klal Yisrael. It's referring to the tzaddikim. The Targum says, Dihav l'tzadikaya, he gives the tzaddikim, the mishalhan lefiskame oraisa, who listen to the words of the Torah, chuchma, wisdom, that this concept that God infuses the weak with koach is not only to Klal Yisrael in general, but it's specifically referring to the tzaddikim, and in that case, that may explain why it's after Oizer Yisrael b'Gvura, Oitar Yisrael b'Sefara. It's not just to Klal Yisrael in general, like Oizer Yisrael b'Gvura and Oitar Yisrael b'Sefara. It's not for the highest level of the nation, and namely the tzaddikim. But just to speak for a few minutes, what does this mean that Hashem gives the LaYaef koach? Because a few psukim later, 2 psukim later in the Tanakh, it says, V'koyeh Hashem yachalifu koach. Those who hope to God will be invigorated with strength. Ya'alu ever kanasham, they will grow a limb like an eagle. Yarutzu v'lo yigo, they will run and not be tired. Yelchu, they will go v'lo yafu, they will never be tired. So there's this concept that tzaddikim are always invigorated with strength and energy. On the other hand, we find the guy by the name of Esav. The Gemara Bava Basra says that on that fateful day, the day of the Petira of Avraham Avinu, Esav violated what? 5 averos. What did he do wrong? He was Baal Nara Hamurasa. He killed. He stole, yeah? He was Mavaza the Bechira, and he was koifer b'tchias hamesim. Fine. But Marav Rabbi, what was the cause of all of Esav's plummeting?
Oh, yeah.
He was tired. He was burnt out.
Oh, yeah.
Vayozed Yaakov nozed. Yaakov was cooking a stew. Vayava Esav min asada vehu LaYaef. All of Esav's terrible sins, murder, adultery, heresy, it's because he was worn out. He's burnt out. Rabbi, I'm burnt out. I already davened yesterday and the day before. I'm burnt out. That is the source of all evil in the world. When a person is de-energized.
He was only 15. No kid.
Yeah, he was the...
15.
See what's going on today. Okay? Says the Reb Simcha Zisel Broida, the Rosh Hashiva of Hebron, Zecharna Levracha. From here we learn that Ayefos was the beginning of the downfall that occurred to Esav. It caused him to go off the straight and the narrow, and turned him and causes him to plummet till he reached the madrega where he murdered, he committed adultery, and he was a heretic. Until that day, he was Avraham Yitzchak Esav. Until that day, he was the grandson of Avraham. He was the son of Yitzchak. After that day, he's nothing. Why? Because he was burnt out. Avraham died. How do I know that? Because why did Avraham die that day? So Avraham should not see Esav go off. That means until that day he hadn't gone off. Now,
Burnout, that's what you do to yourself. It comes.
it's something you allow to happen.
How do you allow to happen? I mean, a person is burned out, tired. I took some
Now,
burned out. What do you do not to be burned out?
Now, as soon as a person falls to the madrega of Ayefos and Yush, this allows a person to commit every wrongdoing. On the other, that's Esav. Let's talk about Yaakov Avinu. We have the pasuk V'koyeh Hashem Yachalifu Koach. So look in Ois Beis. Yisoid Gadol Lamadnu Parshazu. Reishis Ho'avadoin V'hayitzil L'tar B'sroi Kasher Ha'adam Nasa Oyef. Burnout causes a person to plummet. In a status of burnout, when a taiva comes, you do not have the wherewithal. You're worn. You're going to give up your entire future for a pot of beans. Now, when a person becomes oyef from a spiritual point of view, then harezu toitza shel yerida va'avadoin koach hayitzir va'koach yunishish v'nefesh. On the other hand, you have the concept of a koye Hashem yachalifu koach. Well, those who hope to God, those who are attached to God, are always invigorated and are always inspired. The essence of the soul is the creativity, the vitality, the ability to fly and to move. But when a person is oyef and shafal, so you look down on yourself, you look down on your own ability, meaning when a person is invigorated and energized, then he respects himself and doesn't allow himself to fall. When a person is burnt out, he doesn't have the self-respect to keep a person away from making a mistake. Now, Marv Rabbi, who came to us? Who attacks us when we're oyef yagea? Amalek. All bad happens. The Jews were burnt out, they're tired, they're weary. You're in big trouble. That's when all evil happens. But on the other hand, let's talk about Yaakov Avinu. Yaakov Avinu had just traveled from the Har HaBayis. He hadn't slept in 14 years. He had every excuse in the world to be burnt out, to be tired. He comes to Haran. He's sitting there. There's a flock of shepherds. These shepherds were like 7 feet tall. They were big. They were burly. They couldn't budge the rock. What does it say about Yaakov Avinu? Vayar v'hinei be'er b'asada v'hinei sham shloisha edrei tzayin roivtzim aleh. Says the Ramban, Yarech ha'kosav b'sipra hazeh l'hoidiyanu, that Yaakov Avinu, a little rabbi, he took the rock and he flicked off the rock like you take off a bottle cap. How did he do it? Koyeh Hashem yachalifu koyach. Those who hope to God are invigorated with strength, and their fear of God gives them ois. But even though he's tired, he didn't sell his life away like Esav. He was able to roll off the stone, the Ramban says. Something that 3 flocks of sheep who had big burly shepherds, they couldn't do it. How did he do it? Because he's always invigorated with strength. He's always energized. That's the difference between Yaakov and Esav. Esav is 15 years old. He just came back he has big muscles, but he's burnt out emotionally. Yaakov Avinu just came back from a long travel, but God invigorated him with strength. Because v'koya Hashem yachalifu baderech. When does Amalek come? Look at number 14. Asher karecha baderech v'yizanebecha kol hanecha sholim acharecha v'yata LaYaef v'yagea v'lo yarei Elokim. Says Reb Simcha Zisel, the first bracha, the first war that occurred to Klal Yisrael, the Torah says it happened in next week's parsha. Vayavoy Amalek vayilachem Yisrael b'Refidim. Why Refidim? We were Rafa Yadayim Minat Torah. Now we didn't learn. We learned. When did Amalek come? We learned. But we just whatever. We learned. We slackened. Amalek comes not when you close the Gemara. When you slack.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.